Well, thanks everybody for coming along for an afternoon's discussion and debate about the relationship between psychoanalysis and the arts. Very briefly, most of you will know that the Artist Rooms collection was acquired via the dealer Anthony Doffey, and is now jointly owned by National Galleries of Scotland and Tate. And its main sort of purpose is a massive national tour of individual rooms devoted to artists in the collection. There are 36 artists in the collection now. I think there's about 1,400 works. And it's continuing to grow. The research partnership is about creating vehicles for research into that collection in all kinds of ways. So it's a sort of multifaceted thing, including talking about psychoanalysis and the arts. Now, the occasion for doing this is the current Louise Bourgeois Artist Rooms show at Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, Modern One, which it closes quite soon, so do go and see it if you haven't. And many of you will have attended the Louise Bourgeois conference called Future Bourgeois, which we held, I think, on the 7th of February, which was a kind of circus event, really. It had all kinds of dimensions, went on for about 9 hours. I mean, one of the things that's striking about Louise Bourgeois as an artist, and which particularly suits her, I suppose, to this monographic model that characterises the Artist Rooms project, is her self-conscious self-analysis through her work and her discourse about that process of self-analysis. So this work, which is on display at the moment, which when I look at it, I always see Duchamp's large glass, but that's just me because I'm a sort of Duchamp guy. Nevertheless, it's a work which you could use as emblematic of our discussion today, conscious and unconscious. I'm not sure which is which of these two strange personalities inside this glass vitrine. But you can see there, this is an example of the way Bourgeois is a post-Freudian artist, is an artist whose whole practice is framed in terms of the notion that the personality is fractured, that we are not perhaps at home with ourselves and so on. The unconscious is something which is volcanic in tone, and you cannot do anything about it. You better be its friend, or accept it, or love it if you can, because it might get the better of you. You never know. Now, from all kinds of perspectives, we might think of this as a sort of problematic statement. So I guess that's a kind of frame in which we can think about the relationship between psychoanalysis and the arts. It's rather like the situation some 50 years before with Salvador Dali constructing his practice in the late 20s in the context of surrealism in terms of an explicit representation of unconscious desires. And Freud didn't really understand that project, that an artist could do that. So I guess there's that question all the time about what is it for an artist after Freud to engage with psychoanalysis, and what does that mean for the intentionality of the work of art and so on. Psychoanalysis is, I guess, one of the great interpretative machines of the humanities, and I think in that way we can open it up in many different directions beyond that autobiographical frame. So that's, I guess, the the overall sort of context of what we're doing today, I think we probably will touch a little bit more on Bourgeois, but mostly not. I just wanted to mention that and encourage people to go and see the show, which is called A Woman Without Secrets. So I'm going to hand over now to a marvellous curator of the day, David Hodge, just here. David I know from my time at Essex, who, as a PhD student, great PhD student, working on Robert Morris. But he's just co-curated an exhibition of contemporary Iranian art, which is kind of a departure. And he's also working at the moment on a collection of texts on an Iranian artist, Siya Ahmadjani. So I'm going to hand over to David to on the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. I'm keen on not saying very much as introduction because we have a panel of fantastic speakers here that I'm eager to get onto. So maybe I'll start by introducing what this session is and what it's about. So as you can see, we have 3 speakers on a panel rather than just one. And what we're going to do is each of our speakers have been asked to respond to the general topic of the event this afternoon, which is psychoanalysis beyond psychobiography. So, as Neil has already briefly mentioned, psychoanalysis in its relationship with the arts has often been associated and often been criticised for being very heavily related to biography. Freud's early study of Leonardo Da Vinci being something people often return to as a sort of model of what psychoanalysis can do in relation to the arts. So that's something that many artists have resisted, have not wanted to have a part of. It's also something that a lot of writers have resisted. And so today's event is about thinking of ways in which psychoanalysis might have some application to the arts, which doesn't necessarily link with biography, which could be a very different kind of approach. And we have 3 speakers here who are all in different ways, I think, going to respond to that general issue. So I'll introduce our speakers on the panel. Right to my left is Anushka Gross, who is a practicing psychoanalyst. I think we're very lucky today to have people here who are not only working as writers in the humanities, but also practicing in psychoanalysis, which should give us an insight into a very different side of the field. Anushka is also a member of the Centre for Freudian Research. Is that the right title?
Yeah, Freudian Analysis and Research.
Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research. And lectures regularly there. Is also has written 2 novels? Yeah, I'm sort of ad-libbing based on having read your biography last night. So if I make it up,
it's
please
fine.
let everyone know that I'm just lying. And has also written the book, Are You Considering Therapy? Which is a book for people who may be considering therapy. And Anushka also plays in Martin Creed's band. Right? Beth Williamson is an art historian and lecturer based in London who is involved in a number of research projects. She's been working for some years as a research fellow at the Tate, working on a project on art school education in the UK since the 1960s. Has also been working for some time on the topic of artist books. At the moment, it's specifically looking at digital transformations in the field of artist books. But perhaps the reason that she's invited here today is a strong background in research on the relationship between psychoanalysis and the arts. And at the moment, Beth is working on a book on a monograph on the psychoanalytic art historian Anton Ehrenzweig, which is being published through Ashgate Visual Press, is that right?
Yeah, Ashgate, yeah.
Very soon. And on the far left of the panel, we have Matt Fitch, who is the Assistant Director of the... Deputy Director of the Psychoanalytic Centre at the University of Essex. Matt's last book publication was on 19th century theories of the unconscious, which precede the Freudian theory of the unconscious. And Matt's also written various essays on psychoanalysis and modernist literature. So what's going to happen is that we'll have a sort of 10-minute piece from each of our speakers, which will briefly outline an idea, a position, a set of issues in relation to the general topic. So that will be about half an hour in total. And then we'll have another half an hour where we're hoping to open the discussion up to the group. And there's an easy tendency when the room is laid out as it is, people to think that there's speakers speaking and listeners listening, and it is very much supposed to be a workshop. So if you have questions, ideas, issues, it would be really interesting to hear from everybody in the room and turn that into real discussion. I'm now going to hand over. I'm going to be sat here looking at my phone, and I promise that I'm not waiting for a call. I'm going to be sort of timing, yeah, but I won't be too rough.
Okay.
Okay.
Better start.
Let's get your image. Should we have an image? It won't count towards your time.
Oh yeah, okay. I might get ahead. I'll start now before you press the button. Yeah, perfect. That's yes, I was going to definitely touch on Louise Bourgeois, if that's all right. Because
is that big enough? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. It's big enough, but can you read? I mean, it's scribbly writing as well.
That's better. That's good.
Ooh.
You can read some of those words. There you go.
If you can read some of it,
I'm going to stop messing around and let you carry on.
That's all right. Yeah. So we know that Louise Bourgeois is an artist who spoke a lot about the autobiographical precedents for her work. And she had plenty to say about making objects as a way of responding and processing difficult feelings like unhappiness, rage, and confusion. And we now know that she was also in analysis for a massive chunk of her life. So it appears that she valued psychoanalysis as a practice, but at the same time, she seems to have really objected to any kind of reductive psychoanalytic readings of her work. So this idea that psychoanalysis is a kind of key that can tell you the secret meanings of things, or as a kind of authoritative discourse that reveals the truth about artworks or books, was something that she understandably seemed to find incredibly annoying. So in interviews, you always see her saying kind of, those shapes aren't phalluses, and, you know, don't worry about the fact that there's kind of foreskin and whatever, it's not a phallus, you know, it's not a breast, whatever. So whatever anybody, you know, journalists, curators, feminists, tried to say about her work, or tried to say her work was about, it seemed that she'd always object. And it can look, if you watch the film, it can look really kind of capricious, but of course you have to take it seriously, because it seems that, you know, what she's ultimately saying is that she doesn't want kind of reductive meanings to be imposed on those objects, so people can just look at them and go, oh yeah, it's a breast or whatever. So there were some boxes of notes found shortly before and more after her death concerning her analysis, amongst other things, you know, her family life and her work, etc. So she was in analysis on and off for over 30 years, often 4 times a week. And some things in the notes kind of seem to provoke questions about what psychoanalysis might be for, and also, I think, maybe whether cure is a relevant topic for psychoanalysts or for people in analysis, and perhaps especially for artists in analysis. So, you know, if you read Freud, this idea of cure, in the 1890s, everybody gets better. He just asks them a few questions, they have a memory, and then they get better. But he reviews that position as he goes along. So by 1937, you've got the essay Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and nobody gets better, it's just an interesting process. So it seems that Louise Bourgeois, from reading the notes, felt quite ambivalent about her personal analysis, but and also about the set of theories in general. But in a way, I think that brings out the kind of polarities of love and hate. So she doesn't seem to have been indifferent to psychoanalysis. She seems to have thought kind of at the same time that it was something really excellent and something really lame. And so in these notes, and a lot of the notes were exhibited at the Freud Museum. I don't know if anybody went, but in 2012 there was an exhibition of the notes, so you could read lots of them. But in that exhibition, you got something, I don't know, that you don't always see, but instead of this suggestion that psychoanalysis is going to explain something about art, you got to see what an artist who had a lot of experience of psychoanalysis thought about psychoanalysis. So in this particular note, it's a list of things that the personal analysis was for Louise Bourgeois. So she says, I won't read the whole thing, it's there, but it goes from, you know, is a job, is a trap, is a privilege, is a luxury, is a duty, etc., etc. Makes me powerless, makes me into a cop, is a love affair, is a bore, is a nuisance, is a pain in the neck. It's sort of a list that kind of goes everywhere. It's quite thorough. But it seems to be a list that invites thinking about what the analysis was for and what it's for in general. Is it to make people feel better? Is it to access difficult truths? Is it to kind of get under the surface of worldly phenomena like, you know, politics, religion, art? Is it to preserve a space for people to articulate something quite particular about their own subjectivity? And if it's for that, then does that actually help anyone or not? So artists and writers, as you're saying, have historically been very receptive to psychoanalysis, and not just the surrealists, but even today, if you go, I don't know, to Goldsmiths, the psychology department doesn't even have a module on psychoanalysis, but if you go to the art department or the literature department, they'll bang on about Freud and Lacan all the time. But at the same time as artists being quite, you know, interested, there's also typically been a serious kind of suspicion around psychoanalysis. And so there are these two big myths. One, that women artists shouldn't have children, or actually, if you read Cyril Connolly, no artist should have children. And also that artists shouldn't do psychoanalysis. So why not? But I don't know. But you hear these, I don't know, pronouncements from people like Rachel Whiteread has said, I don't need therapy, I have my studio. And so she kind of puts the two together, because I've got this, don't need to do that. And there's this kind of threat of losing your mojo if you stop feeling screwed up. And maybe a different way of putting those things together in the Louise Bourgeois exhibition, you've got the thing, art is a guarantee of sanity, as if making art is a cure in itself. So why that link? Well, in Freudian theory, art production and the psychological symptom are conceived as coming from the same place. So the pathogenic material, or the repressed idea, might be expressed as kind of aches and pains or phobias, or it might be expressed through novels or sculptures or whatever. So art making and suffering are bound together, and obviously that's not just in psychoanalytic theory, that's in the popular imagination, and you hear enough about it from artists too. So if you stop suffering, you'll stop making art. But as a kind of alternative way of thinking about it, psychoanalysis can in itself be conceived of as a kind of art practice for the patient as well as for the analyst. And maybe at the most pronounced end of that, you have the kind of clinical performances of Jacques Lacan, these performances for an audience of one, and all the stories like dropping his trousers in front of a patient or throwing his plant pots out of the window as the patient's leaving the consulting room, whatever it is. But there's a brilliant book, I don't think it's translated, I think only the French can take it. So these performances kind of in the line of Dada situationism, and obviously that's very threatening to people who want to see a psychoanalyst as an authority figure or as an embodiment of kind of perfect psychic normality. But so these kind of psychoanalytic interventions try to take people by surprise and kind of throw them off track, rather than aiming to make them be more sensible. And so it's kind of the opposite of a sort of explanatory practice. And you might, in an analysis like that, you might get effects. You might feel happier or sadder or, you know, whatever, without knowing why. It wouldn't be about naming it. It's these performances might produce effects in you, and you wouldn't have to say what they were. And I don't know, I should see the time, but Louise Bourgeois was definitely not in an analysis like that. She was going to see the ultimate boring American ego psychologist. But anyway, so yeah, maybe he was trying to make her a bit more sensible. But in terms of this relationship between psychoanalysis and art, sometimes when you put the two together, it can be a bit kind of deadening, as if, you know, two things that are too interesting kind of cancel each other out. And maybe partly because of this idea that psychoanalysis is going to explain art, or the, you know, phenomenon of art production. And sometimes you see these kind of meek psychoanalysts saying, oh, we're so boring and you artists are so interesting because we've got our theories and you've got your drives and your imaginations, all this stuff. But what are they really saying when they're saying that? They're making it appear that they have some kind of stable form of knowledge or are experts, while the artists are like sort of crazy children. But a lot of the ideas that you come across in psychoanalytic theory are as kind of paradoxical, unstable, and shocking as anything you can find in you know, a novel or an art exhibition. So it's a kind of sleight of hand trick to pretend that it's not like that. And Freud and his immediate circle were massively guilty of practicing that trick, because if they weren't perceived as proper, according to, I don't know, Freud's anxiety, they the whole project of psychoanalysis would be put at risk. So everybody had to be married and sensible if they were going to be allowed in that circle. So, and it's possible that some analysts find the levels of uncertainty that they work with very, very disconcerting, because you don't know what effects your interventions are going to have. So you can try to be really, really nice to somebody because you think, oh, I'll be nice then, and they can just hate you for it. They can react really badly. Or you can go in with something totally brutal and think, oh, what have I done? And then, you know, weeks later they say that's the best thing anybody's ever said to them. So you don't know. And so the idea that when you're practicing analysis, you're engaged in kind of anything like a sensible discourse is an illusion. So it seems, I think, from these notes that Louise Bourgeois took analysis very seriously as an encounter and as a practice, but not as an explanatory discourse. It's something more like a very potentially volatile human experiment. And she wrote an essay called Freud's Toys in Art Forum. And in that essay, I don't know if you've read it, she's really dismissive of Freud. She just thinks he's a paternalistic bastard with bad taste, and his work's rubbish and he doesn't help artists. But so you sort of, on the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, you have something like this list, which shows that she was incredibly engaged with whatever she was trying to do in analysis, and it was annoying and boring and exciting and frustrating and very, very necessary. So, you know, all the things that you might go through if you do a long analysis and try to take it seriously, even though, as she says, psychoanalysis is a joke. But so that's the list of somebody who's really caught up in analysis and is trying to do something with it. But it's obviously being very, very open-minded about what that something could be. And that kind of work, I think, can't possibly be reduced to kind of, I don't know, pegging your existence into a sensibly narrativized biography that fully explains why you do the things you do. And that would be just as true for an artist, as for a banker, as for a trainee analyst.
Well, that was perfect timing. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Beth, but if you have questions, comments, ideas about that, remember them, write them down. We'll come back in the discussion. But let's move on to Beth Johnson.
Okay, I'm going to talk about something quite different. I want to pick up on the key question that set out in the brief, asking whether psychoanalytic methods can help us to explain aesthetic experience, and whether that model of self and other and the relationship with the outside world is useful when we think about art. And I want to think about that historically and in contemporary times too. So using the ideas of the art theorist Anton Ehrenzweig as a kind of historical point of reference, not just because he's someone that I've researched, but because he was acutely interested in the relationship between self and other, or what he called self and not self. And he actually writes about the idea of the work of art functioning like another person, so really a dialogue between the artist and the work of art, or between the viewer and the work of art. His ideas were most certainly beyond biography, because he was interested not so much in the content of art, but in the structural dynamics of the creative process, what was actually going on when it was made. And he was also, I think, in a sense, beyond art, in that he was interested in cultural life more broadly, and in creativity and helping people think creatively, so much broader than that. He was also, he proposes an aesthetic that applies equally to the artist making art and to the viewer, so he brings the making and viewing together in his ideas. And he operates, I think, something that's quite important for what we're thinking about today and thinking about relevance, is that he operated between art practice and art history and psychoanalysis. So he was in dialogue with colleagues in all these different disciplines, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And also, his ideas were very rooted in experience, so that theory always follows practice, whether that's art practice or writing art history or writing art criticism. Again, quite important for thinking about whether the theoretical approach you're taking is relevant. The context in which he was working in, you know, this idea of in-betweenness, being between disciplines, I think is an important one, because it meant that he was in dialogue with all these different disciplines, not displaying any particular allegiance to any one or the other. And I think that position of being in between disciplines, you know, we could take that as a point of weakness, that actually for him and anyone who takes that position, really, that, you know, it could be a kind of, you know, the kind of common phrase, jack of all trades, master of none. If you're in that kind of central position, maybe it's a weakness, and maybe the result of being in that position, maybe it's not of any value. You could take the opposite view, which is the one that I take actually, that's a position of advantage, and it's an opportunity to bring different disciplines together in new ways and to enrich our understanding of art, of psychoanalysis, and fundamentally, I guess, of what it is to be human. He was working in the 50s and 60s. He was working in the wake of the Freud-Klein controversies of the early 40s. So there was a real rupture there when psychoanalysis was being hotly debated. It was part of mainstream culture. So it was entirely relevant at that point that he should turn to psychoanalysis and think about that in relation to art. Why not? Whether it's still as relevant now, I guess, is what we're here to think about, and I'm not sure. We can talk about that. I think the other thing that's really important in thinking about the relevance and whether psychoanalysis is useful is the way that you bring the disciplines together. I said that for Ehrenzweig, theory followed practice and experience, and that, for me, I see that very much coming from the kind of roles that he performed, the kind of jobs that he did in art schools. It wasn't until just 2 years before his death that he actually took up a teaching position in an art school. Before that, he always fulfilled very practical, technical roles. So he was a dye technician, he was a screen printing technician for Pollock, for instance. He was a colour mixer at the Central School for a while. He was a colour mixer at Ravensbourne and other places. And I think, you know, he says that in his archive, he explains that as something that gave him intellectual independence and allowed him to develop his ideas. I think the other reason for that, I suspect, is that it allowed him to work really closely with artists, so that he could really closely observe the creative process and really get to know artists on a kind of one-to-one basis. And I think if we're going to engage with psychoanalysis, as art historians or artists, if we're going to engage with psychoanalysis, then we really need to be thinking about process, the process of making and viewing, and not thinking about content, not thinking about biography. And we really need to be observing what artists are doing, looking at the archives and seeing what they're writing about their own process. And ideally, I think we should be talking to artists much, much more than perhaps many of us do as art historians. So why is any of this, why are Ehrenzweig's ideas still relevant? Well, I think the contemporary relevance of what he had to say, I think it comes from his engagement with psychoanalytic ideas about creativity in all aspects of human life. So it's not just about art. And that really, those kind of ideas sit quite well with the contemporary thinking of people like Ken Robinson, and thinking about education more broadly as a holistic process for people of all ages. He talks particularly about children, but it's for people of all ages. So it's going beyond the idea of art or art education and thinking about education much more broadly. And Robinson talks about the kind of rapid changes that are taking place in society now, and how the way in which organisations and institutions have identified the need for people who can think creatively. And I think if we, that means thinking about how that process works, how we can be creative. So if we can understand the creative process, how we can bring art and psychoanalysis together better, then maybe we can understand how we can, educate people who are more creative in their thinking to work in all sorts of roles.
Yeah.
Okay. So is psychoanalysis still useful in thinking about art and aesthetics today? I think the simple answer is yes, because it provides a model of thinking about the structural dynamics of the process of making and viewing, and that takes us beyond biography and beyond content, purely content. I think the more complex answer is probably that yes, but there are limits, because I think there are many more tools, many more methods that we could adopt. If we think about the kinds of digital tools and scientific tools that art historians and the arts and humanities in general are taking up now, that have, equally have the potential to enrich our understanding of how we make and view art. And those, I think, can perhaps don't negate the usefulness of psychoanalysis, but certainly extend our understanding and augment that understanding. I think I'll stop there. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. Again, please remember any questions and ideas and comments that you have, and we'll move on to Matt, our final panelist.
So I'm just going to put together a few observations that again stem from the kind of overarching title, and particularly this question of beyond psychobiography. And the first point I want to make is just that there is this assumption that Freud's notion of psychobiography is very reductive. And just by the way, I was rereading the sort of mini book on Leonardo Da Vinci. I don't know how many people have read it. But in fact, there's a lot.
Just one.
Just one. Well, as you'll know, there's actually a lot in there that forever complicates the notion of a biography. It totally dismantles, I guess, the contemporary notions of biography, because he raises issues about how we reconstruct our lives as we go on, his notion of screen memory and all sorts of things. But that's by the way. But the point I wanted to make was a simpler one, which is that if you went back to 1910 or 1908 and looked at literary criticism, you'd find probably works that were just as disappointingly focused on biography, the biography of the writer, or were symbol spotting. And of course, literary criticism has had a development throughout the 20th century that's taken it through various kinds of formalism and structuralism, so Marxism, feminism, post-colonialism. And exactly the same has happened in psychoanalytic criticism. And that's quite apart from the developments within psychoanalysis itself between different schools. So I think we need to think very broadly about what a psychoanalytic theory of art or criticism of art might mean, and it could mean a lot of different things. And I suppose to go back to psychoanalysis and think of art in a different way, a good place to start would be the interpretation of dreams, and particularly Freud's notion of dreams coming in the form of visual representations. I mean, he brings this up in a number of different ways, but most famously saying that our emotions, our unconscious emotions, are forced to articulate themselves in visual symbols or visual scenarios. And it may sound like a point I'm making about psychoanalysis and art, but it's much broader than that. Really, it's about the psychoanalytic notion of unconscious fantasy, in which most psychoanalysts propose that we have another way of thinking from the way we describe our conscious thoughts, in which emotions and gestures and various kinds of unconscious impulses or motivations might get reflected or performed or put into kind of scenarios that may be visual ones. Certainly that's the way many psychoanalysts describe it. And this is famously was taken forward by Melanie Klein in her work with children from the 1920s onwards. And she called this fantasy with a PH to distinguish it from kind of conscious forms of fantasy. And Melanie Klein used a play technique with children in order to try to observe their fantasies. She argued that when you see children playing with toys, whatever they're acting out also relays something of internal emotional pressures that they're unable to articulate in words. And I think there's two important points I want to draw from this. One is that fantasy can be something that's enacted out there. We can get away from the notion of a private world, which we might associate with dreams, where something is happening internally that no one else can see. In fact, according to Klein and lots of other psychoanalysts, we project fantasy all the time outside. And the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott moved this forward yet again. He was one of, again as a student of Klein, in his experiments with play and children, and he came up with the idea of a transitional object, which he used to describe, a child, a baby's first relationship to an object, which might be a blanket or a little teddy bear or toy. And he said that basically it's not about a division between a subject and an object. Actually, this transitional object, its first kind of material possession, is a piece of the outside reality that's actually wholly animated by the child's internal life. It's treated as a real person that comes alive. So what I want to sort of draw to your attention is the idea of an intermediate world, sort of grey area, which is neither just material reality and not just someone's notional psychical inner space, but a kind of mediating ground between the two of them. And both Klein and Winnicott argued, firstly, that this activity you can witness in children never recedes, that as we grow up, it just simply gets more diffused, and it gets expressed in religion, in culture, and artworks, but in other forms, in our relationships, in almost anything we do, they would argue, certain unconscious impulses and gestures get projected into those activities. So there's a Kleinian psychoanalyst called Hannah Siegel, who argued that unconscious fantasy underlies and colours all our activities, however realistic. And I think the however realistic is interesting because it finally breaks down the barrier between fantasy and reality. So that was some initial observations I wanted to lay down, just to draw this idea of unconscious fantasy to your attention in a very general way. And then I want to base a few sort of summing up comments on it, and if I have time, give a very little vignette. So one point to make is when I began thinking this through, I thought, right, this is my argument against psychobiography. And I realise now, actually, it's still biographical. I mean, you could argue it's still biographical. Because if I'm saying that everything we do has little bits of subjectivity attached to it, little bits of psychical life, then you're not really outside the realm of biography. But it would certainly be a biography considered in a very different light, no longer attached to a kind of linear notion of someone's life from childhood to adulthood. But we're still attached to people's lives in some ways. The second would be that I wouldn't argue, I mean, my only approach to psychoanalysis in as a form of interpretation of either art or literature, which I'm, I suppose, more familiar with, is that it's not about making a particular interpretation. I think, in a way, this repeats things that both of you have said. It's not about spotting the interpretation that gets it right. For me, it's recognizing an activity that goes on all the time anyway, which is the way we encounter both people and artworks and invest them with aspects of our internal life. You could say, certainly as regards art objects, there's an intimate commerce that goes on around them all the time. People are in dialogue with artworks and with each other through artworks. And I would argue psychoanalysis allows you to pose questions in such a way that brings that into the frame. So thirdly, I'd say I don't think criticism has to do this. So I acknowledge, of course, you could have a purely material description of the history of an artwork or a sociological one. And I guess a lot of things I read are those kinds of works. So this is not a kind of a description of what should be done, but I'm just saying these aspects are indubitably there if we open up a frame of questioning towards them. And finally, a slightly more complicated point. I would argue that this notion of unconscious fantasy, once we bring that into the frame, it may allow us to recognize aspects of an artwork or details within an artwork which we might have a strong attachment to or association to. They may stand out as points of truth or validity or importance. And by this I mean when we engage with an artwork, to take an example, we may become fascinated with a particular detail or a particular artist, or we may obsess about a particular quality. You may have a relationship with artworks or novels, which means that we carry them in our minds for a number of years. So we are internalizing them. And I suppose psychoanalysis might allow us to reflect on the nature of that engagement or on aspects of it that we're not thoroughly aware of, because this object, as well as being out there, is also living inside us. We're sort of cohabiting with it, and it's obviously participating in things we do. And I guess I don't see that just as an individual question. We may do that in groups as well. So have I got just a couple of minutes? Well, I'll just activate this. I just wanted to give a very quick example. As a way of giving an example, I'm not a clinician, so I have to draw an example for myself. But this is just to say that when I was in my late teens, I had a very strong attraction to the German romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich. I became kind of slightly, not obsessive as well, but I just got really into it. And that's a famous picture by him. There are many others that grace lots of sort of Penguin book covers. So I'm sure you all might be familiar with the kind of work. So the points I want to make very quickly are that, looking back on it now, I can see lots of things that were determining my interest in Friedrich, apart from the fact that I just became interested in his art or saw it. One is that my mother is German, so there is an aspect of my recognition, of her recognition, that I was becoming interested in her culture. A more complicated one, I think this is just the second point I'll make, was that through these pictures, which are full of ruins and shadows and unspoken elements, I was also engaging with aspects of German culture, which I'm talking about the late 70s, early 80s. In terms of my own family history, pointed back to unspoken narratives about the Second World War and ruin and destruction. And I would argue that through an engagement with ruin and destruction in these paintings, I was also fueling a kind of fascination with things that weren't quite being articulated, and also had this kind of Gothic, sublime, and I suppose horrific elements to them. And then there's a third place we could go using Kleinian theory, which would be what internal what internal fascination with destruction might anyone have? We all have destructive or regressive drives, but also might be mediated through paintings, which are full of ruined buildings and shadows and occasionally skeletons and things like that. So the point I'm making with all of this is not that I could write a very great paper about Friedrich that would be of interest to everyone, because I'm aware of his facets. It's that if I, in my 20s, had gone to do art history as I was going to do, and had ended up doing a PhD on Friedrich, I can see now that whatever I had said, however much motivated by historical or sociological or Marxist points, that the points I had become fascinated by in the paintings and my fascination with Friedrich would also have been fueled by a lot of unconscious motivations, and that to become aware of that greatly enlarges your ability to negotiate the way we project things onto pictures and then make further decisions about how we interpret that.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you. So that was three great pieces that I think could go in lots of different directions. I've got a couple of ideas of things that we could bury into that seem to sort of go across them, but I'm keen on getting as many voices into the conversation as we can. So if people have questions or comments, there we go.
Thank you, all three of you, because I've got a lot out of all three. It's amazing, that you got so much out in half an hour. There were two things that I thought might be quite interesting. The first is less interesting, I think, because it might be a little bit dry, but it's from something you said, Beth, about biography. And that we should all, and it's something I couldn't agree with more, we should all, talk to artists more and be interested in what artists say about the work that they do and how they are and so on. And it's something I've been banging on about for a long time. But you said it as if that was, this isn't a criticism, it's just that needs to go along with an explanation of why that's important. And the reason I say that is because I was at a seminar just last week. I won't tell you where or who the speaker was, which was on Picasso.
It wasn't me.
It wasn't you. It was on Picasso, and it was on his drawings from the 1920s. And the speaker was using pseudo-psychoanalytic theory, Foucault and so on, from the 1960s. And it just, and there was an awful lot of this, at least an hour's worth of stuff, which was, it seemed to be quite speculative, yeah? So the question arose, have you looked into what Picasso said about, what he was doing? Because obviously he had a say in it at the time. And clearly he hadn't, but what was even more shocking than that was that I mistakenly used the word intention. And you should have heard the sharp intake of breath throughout the room as the word intention came in there. Because, why? Because everybody knows this taboo about biography. So I think this thing of we must go beyond biography, and you raised this in what you were saying, has become problematic in itself. And it's caused all sorts of difficulties. And the one I was thinking of was the idea of objectivity, because as you were saying at the end, if you want to, well, I was thinking of your PhD, I was thinking, well, should he have done yesterday for free?
It's too late.
Yeah, but if I were your PhD advisor, would I advise you to do something you hate, that you really didn't like, that you couldn't empathise with, and that would increase your objectivity and produce a better PhD? Or would I have encouraged you to follow your passion and the thing that was really motivating you, albeit that I knew that was going to skew your view of it, you were going to produce something potentially sentimental. So it's raised all sorts of, sorry, that's not a question, but I just
But isn't the awful thing that if you'd picked some other artist that he'd never even heard of, his unconscious would have warped whatever study he'd done on that artist too, of course. There's no escape.
No, it's
can I ask that we introduce ourselves when we ask a question?
Oh, sorry, my name's David Hawkes. I'm from Norwich. But I was thinking, just to respond to that, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously we're always going to be tainted, let's say, whatever we do. But one would hope that, you know, there can be a high degree of objectivity. So it's about degree. It is about saying, well, you know, am I too into this artist, or am I able to stand back and really survey it carefully, and yet be? Well, I think maybe there's something about an honesty here, about revealing one's prejudices. So, would you follow that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know about this sort of. Is it possible to sort of overvalue objectivity and to idealise that? And is that the only way to, you know, to have something to say about worldly stuff?
I mean, to point out, Louise, around this from this college, and just thinking about process. You know, we hear an awful lot about process, of course, at the art college. And the thing about that is, you could have a very interesting process which results in a pretty mediocre work of art.
Yeah.
So, you know, and we also share this I would say almost obsession with process as a kind of enabling rhetoric, right? In teaching art students, obviously.
Yeah.
I personally dislike it intensely, but that's another thing. Because I think it's too much like therapy. And that's a problem. And there is a difference between the outputs, so to speak, from people who are engaged in art therapy and the outputs from artists, right? Now, one engages our attention, of course there's an overlap, but one engages our attention at a rather different level.
Yeah.
Plus, the thing about process sort of drops off the further back you go in the past, and by the time you hit the Renaissance, where there are almost no personal documents, again, thank God, you're forced to look at the art in a rather different way. Yeah. And if you take a psychoanalytic perspective on that. So I just wonder, you know, I mean, can we, you know, if it's just about modern art, i.e. 20th century and 21st century art, then we, that's fine, we're going to limit the discussion to that, okay. But there's a sort of issue here, because this, I suppose then that the concern with the artist's biography and the artist's process is perhaps essential, because in order to become an artist in the industrial era, you have to be self-willed. You have to force yourself to do it. I mean, you can't get employed to do it. Right? There's no structure. There's no guild. There's nothing. You can't just get a job, right? You have to sort of think up some you know, abnormally focused desire, right? I'm just wondering if anybody wants to comment.
I mean, the only thing I wondered about in the beginning of what you were saying was this idea that if art is a kind of therapy, then it's a bit rubbish, and, you know, there are proper things to do in art. And if you look at Louise Bourgeois, it just totally collapses that distinction, I think. And with Rachel Whiteread, you know, I don't need therapy, I have my studio. She absolutely puts the two together. And, you know, if you talk to artists all the time, they'll tell you, if I didn't do this, I'd go mad. You know, that's something that gets repeated and repeated and repeated. And yeah, I wonder if it's possible to separate, you know, therapeutic art and non-therapeutic, proper, valid art.
But my point, I suppose, was that that wasn't always the case, right? And how much of this is just an aspect of our society, or an aspect of the society which really hasn't changed that much for 100 years or so, where you have people who are self-selecting and get interested in art. Plus, there is a rhetoric. I do think it's an enabling rhetoric, as opposed to maybe perhaps absolutely true. You know, Louise Bourgeois' work would be phenomenally good even if we didn't possess a single scrap of autobiographical stuff from her. That's a sort of test point for me, really. You know, is it good if you don't have all this other stuff to say that it's about suffering or it's about...
But it's so funny because there are so many texts where it's just, I mean, there's no, to not know about her but to know the work's almost impossible when, you know, there are all these, I've been to Hell and back and let me tell you it was wonderful. That's, you know, that's her work.
I wondered if she was playing though with the expectations.
Yeah, I mean, you could say it's a language game, but yeah, but then so is everything.
Can I just respond to one thing that, I mean one of the obvious things to say is that it would get more and more difficult to make these kind of psychoanalytic observations, or you have to make them in a different way once you go back beyond the epochs in which people leave a lot of documentation. So I think that the fact that there is no documentation there in the Renaissance, in a way, for me, doesn't mean there's no possibility for a psychical life there. It just means, but also that I guess there are processes that, there are rituals that get enacted internally, individually, and there may be more and more greater encouragement in the 20th century to do that and to sort of self-document. But there are also rituals that go on publicly, and I guess going back to the Renaissance again, if one wanted to think about what is the emotional life of these paintings, you'd also have to think about the relationship between painting and religion, and the kind of ways in which painting and religion together may become foci for all kinds of emotional projections, so some of which is well documented and some of which isn't, but some of which is certainly bizarre, or there's certainly odd things going on. So I think even there are interesting questions, but we may not have the documents to answer them as to what was it like.
Sorry, I don't want to hold this, but this is my point, is that what you do then, considering when you're considering someone like Jerome Bosch or Peter Bruegel, is you look at the culture. So you use the psychoanalytic things to analyse it as a cultural document. In other words, as something that, you know, anyone or a majority of people seeing that painting at that time would share a bunch of psychic categories, if you like, and a sense of where the debates were about these. And surely you can do this with the contemporary stuff as well.
You could do, but it might be, in a way, I would say that you're forced to do that. Because you don't have any other documentation to work on, but it may lead you to very generalizing positions. And I know certainly in the area of history, Renaissance history, there is interesting work being done on trying to struggle to use little bits and pieces to work out more individual responses. There was a lot of work done on Martin Luther, piecing together. I mean, there's been bad work done, but interesting contemporary work done to try to not look anachronistically at him, but to work out, well, in what ways were language of the body and experience of the body and psychical life interrelating with ideologies to produce, you know, to make him say some of the things he was saying in the way he was saying them. So there's still layers of individual psychology that can be unearthed. And I wouldn't say that the notion of a general cultural consciousness is a replacement for that.
There's a hand at the back.
It's Richard Williams, BCA. Just a simple question. To what extent do you think it's important to have some contact with the practice of psychoanalysis or the allied disciplines in order to use the theory?
Ah, you mean if the theory gets cut loose from practice, then is it slightly invalidated?
It could be, contact, it could be as a client, or as a knowing something about contemporary practice of psychoanalysis or allied psychotherapies, or conversations with practitioners. So to what extent is that important?
It's such a good question. So you were talking about it before. Yeah.
Well, I'm an art historian, but when I did my PhD, I actually took attended some of the MA modules in psychoanalysis to understand what students were learning about psychoanalysis, and that was really helpful for me in then understanding what I needed to understand in the archives that I was working with. So, yeah, I do think it's important.
Do you keep up, or do any, obviously not you, Anushka,
try to keep up.
People in this room, do you keep up with contemporary developments in practice? Do they, does that inform what anybody does here?
Contemporary developments in psychoanalytic practice.
Or psychoanalytic practice, or allies, things like that.
I don't, because I haven't really done any more work in that area. But I think if I was going to, I would want to. Yes.
I mean, I do, because I work in a centre that's taught mainly by clinicians. But I'd say that it's not a clear-cut question. So I would agree that it is important to have some contact. I mean, there are ways in which in academia psychoanalytic theory has taken on life of its own, separate from development psychoanalysis, which I guess has produced its own insights, but it can sort of run on empty sometimes. And as soon as you make touch with the kind of clinical thinking, you can see it in a different light. But I'd also say that there was a discussion early on in psychoanalysis about whether people could do so-called wild analysis, whether you had to be a practicing clinical psychoanalyst to use these theories. And Freud came down strongly on the side that you didn't have to, that you could, through understanding culture or having cultural experience and observing yourself and other people, you could reach a certain level. So I think it would be silly to say only psychoanalysts work with clients have access to these sort of transference processes if they're also meant to be going on all the time amongst all of us.
It just seems to me a really important question, because unlike other theories that we might draw on the bodies of knowledge, this one is attached to a body of an area of professional practice, and that has its own momentum and issues and all sorts of things associated with it. But many other theoretical areas we might draw on just don't have that.
I wonder if there's one thing that happens, I don't know, but it's sort of in relation to something you were saying before, but if you're working clinically with psychoanalytic ideas, because they were developed in a clinical context, you can sort of, there are things that you can kind of see what they're for. If you're working with psychotic people, then, I don't know, a concept like foreclosure, don't have to go into it, but you can kind of see what it's for in that context. But sometimes if you see people give academic papers and they're trying to use the concept of foreclosure in relation to a novel, or and they get really confused. And it's actually easy in a way if you use it in the place that it was developed. it makes much more sense. And I wonder if something like that sometimes happens.
But that's a very nice image, because I think that does often happen. Then sometimes academics want to complicate things. They want to turn on the fog machine to make what they're doing seem more interesting than it actually is.
Was there a question over here?
Yeah. I wondered for Anushka actually. In your introduction, did you say, have you written novels?
Yeah.
Have you written a couple of novels? I just wondered, sorry, my name's Lindsay, I'm an artist in second year PhD. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about any crossover between your psychoanalytic practice and writing the novels, if there's any crossover in an approach or methodology, or how the two practices, the creative practice and the psychoanalytic practice, speak to each other.
Yeah, that's so hard to answer. But I always really liked the idea. Somebody said to me when I was training to do psychoanalysis, so I started training after writing these two novels, and somebody said that trainee analysts have to do cryptic crosswords, because if you do cryptic crosswords, it will just teach you something about putting words to how to understand something that doesn't make sense, and to sort of look at elliptical meanings and all that kind of thing. And yet maybe there's something, I don't know, about writing a novel where you're trying to put things that you're trying to drop in clues, you're trying to understand how to make a clue elegant so people don't realise it's a clue until later, all those little things. And I suppose you do see that when people talk to you over time, something that they said in the first session which they glossed over 10 weeks later is like, oh, okay. And so there is something in the sort of structuring of a telling maybe that's got something a bit novelistic about it. But it's a very hard question to answer.
My dad's really great at cryptic crosswords. I certainly got a whole new career there. I had a question I was really keen on asking of all three speakers that I sort of felt was relevant to all of them, which is to do with the object, the art object, the thing that an artist makes. Because it sort of struck me in your piece, Anushka, what you were saying about Bourgeois' concern about the deadening effect of psychoanalysis, which many other people have also had a concern with, is very similar to the sort of classic modernist denigration of the art object as something which comes along after the process finishes and we just look at the object and we don't see the artist anymore. There seems to be a very structural similarity there. And I was thinking that also seems to be the direction that maybe Ehrensweig is going in towards with this thing as process. We should talk more to artists, we should look at the process, we should look at the whole of what creativity is that isn't just the object, because that's deadening and gets us away from the artist. And then in your piece, Matt, although you were more closely talking about objects, in relation to the question of fantasy, the role of the object becomes very complicated and difficult, because the question is, does the object become a sort of occasion for us to do our projecting, or are we really looking at the object and finding out what it's about and what it's consisted of? So I wonder if all of you, any of you, would have anything to say about what role the object itself has then, if we're doing this psychoanalytic approach to art.
You
Difficult
were
one.
talking, you were talking about that already.
It is a difficult one, and I think the one thing I guess I didn't dwell on is how to differentiate the work of the artist in producing an object and the work of reception, because I was kind of implying a process that goes on for everyone, directed towards the object, but of course certain people make objects. I guess my answer would be that I still find it hard to isolate the object from those impulses, whether you're thinking back to the impulse of the artist or the reception. I mean, do you mean like what's the status of the object?
Yeah, I mean, is the object now important in itself, or does it become a kind of occasion for these different impulses, or why why is this one particular object we're looking important and interesting for us? These sort of things.
I don't know. I mean, I guess my only impulse would be to say that whenever people, every time someone tries to make the object wholly autonomous, for me that's an occasion for them to put something into the object and draw a magic circle around it, which is obviously not come from the object itself. Yeah. So I'm not sure of the extent to which you can ever wholly detach it. Certainly in the realm of interpretation, obviously it might exist apart as a literal sculpture. I don't know if you...
I was thinking about, I mean, I don't know if from the whoever artists we've got in the room, thinking about when, the idea of deciding that a work of art is complete, that you've finished, and that it can be kind of released into the world, or and thinking about giving that art object some kind of autonomy, and wondering how what an artist might feel about that or think about that.
I think that there comes a point where the sort of impossible idealistic hopes you had for the thing have to be closed down, and you realise you have to complete it with the ingredients on the table, and then it becomes a different kind of problem.
Yeah, right.
Which is a great relief.
It's a bit like finishing a PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's time for one more question. Are there any? Yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned Martin Luther at the beginning. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about his work in relation to psychoanalysis?
There has to be.
That is putting me in quite a difficult position, but oh my gosh.
I apologise for mentioning it.
No, it's fine. But I mean, he's certainly, somebody who doesn't speak about psychoanalysis explicitly in his work, but somebody who's incredibly interested in psychoanalysis and has none of this fear that psychoanalysis is going to take something away from an artist if they, get engaged with that. So he's definitely, the way he speaks about it definitely seems to be more on the analysis terminable and interminable side, that it's a process that you can go through and it will keep unfolding and it will keep developing, and it's not a cure that dams you up and makes you normal and, makes you stop making art and go and get a job. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to finish with that, move on to the next section. So thank you very much for all our panelists. So shall I go ahead and introduce you? Yeah. So our next session, as you can see from the schedule, is on psychoanalysis, art and war, and it's being run by Kostas Tassinopoulos. I'm very happy to have Kostas here, because when I was first talking to Neil about this event and thinking about the topic of art beyond biography, I read an essay of Kostas's which was very useful in thinking about the sorts of things that we're talking about today. So it's great to have him here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Costas is a PhD student at the University of York, where he's working on things that have a relation to psychoanalysis in the context of war. Specifically, he's looking at things to do with speech and violence amongst artists who have been under situations of war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But his work is very much from a psychoanalytic perspective and a feminist perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go away and let you do a session now. So, please go ahead.
Well, thank you to the organizers for putting together this wonderful event, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. I guess I want to start with a comment from the previous session and a couple of comments from the audience that came up. I wanted to say that there is, I got the sense that there is a sense of anxiety in the sense of our wondering whether psychoanalysis is still useful today, as Beth mentioned. And the pitfalls of coming from an academic perspective and using psychoanalysis to see whether you can make sense of an art object. And I wanted to say that theory can be an object as well. And there is a great essay by Juliet Mitchell on theory as an object, which traces the pitfalls of getting lost in theory and being consumed by theory. And in that way, I also want to say that feeling that anxiety to trace or find a way to make psychoanalysis useful and wonder whether it is useful, that can be a creative thing. Anxiety, it can be a way of related to history in an active mode rather than being consumed by it, and especially to the history of art, psychoanalysis, and war, which is what I will be talking about. So my aim here is not to provide a comprehensive psychoanalytic or art historical account of the relationship of art, war, and psychoanalysis. I want to introduce important moments and topics in this journey among the three areas that have often been theorized separately, but provide stimulating points for discussion when they are thought of together. We will do this by looking at art informed by war, psychoanalysis, and feminism, which unravels many of the dominant narratives on war-related artistic practice and of arts and psychoanalysis interventions in war discourse. I want to start with a quote that is good enough to trace my interests in both in this presentation and my own research. What is there inside one that makes one know all about war, asks Gertrude Stein in Wars I Have Seen in 1945. So war is not something that is outside of us, and certainly not outside of psychoanalysis, art, and their histories. There's going to be a bit of theory in the beginning, so please bear with me, and then we'll jump straight into the art. And this is really a workshop, and I really do want to hear from you, so at any point that you see something arresting, stop me and we'll discuss about it, or you get bored, just say move on to the next thing. So I want to briefly mention some key psychoanalytic works that deal with war, and to keep those in mind as we look at art together, and encourage you to jump in again with the theory too and your own engagement with them and the subject. So Freud's Thoughts for the Times on War and Death was written in 1915, 6 months after the outbreak of the First World War, and describes the saga and disillusionment in the citizen of the civilized world evoked by World War I. Having severed the ties between civilized nations, humanity found itself at war, and the individual was asked to sanction the state's rapacity and lust for power in the name of patriotism, Freud wrote. Disillusionment, however, was unjustified, Freud maintained, because what has been destroyed was precisely an illusion, that states are guardians of moral standards and that individual members of the highest human civilizations are incapable of brutal behavior. In reality, wrote Freud, our fellow citizens have not sunk so low as we feared because they have never risen so high as we believed. Psychoanalysis offers the insight that every earlier development of the mind persists along the later stage that arises from it, and therefore, in mental development, there is a special capacity for regression. War, Freud speculated, brings about such regression, a regression to aggressive impulses and to a capacity for barbarous deeds which has not been eradicated in the individual, but only held in check by a community that now sanctions it. What is more, said Freud, according to Rosalind Deutsch, war is a regression not only to barbarism, but also to the instinctive and impulsive heroism of the unconscious, which does not know its own death. So this is a passage from the Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, where Freud says, Civilized society, which demands good conduct and does not trouble itself about the instinctual basis of this conduct, has thus won over the obedience a great many people who are not in this following their own natures. Encouraged by this success, society has allowed itself to be misled into tightening the moral standard to the greatest possible degree, and it has thus forced its members into a yet greater estrangement from their instinctual disposition. They are constantly subject to an unceasing suppression of instinct, and the resulting tension betrays itself in the most remarkable phenomena of reaction and compensation. There is perpetual readiness of the inhibited instincts to break through to satisfaction at any suitable opportunity. War, then, is a de-repression, as Freud argues, and as Juliet Mitchell investigated later in her work on war, sexuality, and hysteria. Freud traces the impacts of the renunciation of instinct in society and in the individual at times of war, and goes as far as to describe those who abide to the above rules as hypocrites. There are very many more cultural hypocrites than truly civilized men, he states, something that makes their controversy, but as Jacques Rose has argued, psychoanalysis is the place where you can tolerate what the culture cannot hear. The first thing one notices on reading Freud's famous exchange with Einstein on the subject of war, titled Why War, is the dissatisfied, impatient, self-deprecating tone with which Freud writes. By all accounts, Freud found discussion tedious and sterile, Jacqueline Rose suggests. For Rose, war operates in Freud's discourse, and not only in that of Freud, as a limit to the possibility of absolute or total knowledge, at the same time as such absolute or total knowledge seems over and again to be offered as one cause, if not the cause, of war. If war is a break on knowledge, then to try and give a complete answer to the question, something that still seems today of devastating urgency, or rather to try only to answer the question, might paradoxically involve an evasion of its force. The familiar destructiveness of war represents not, as is commonly supposed, finality, but uncertainty, a hovering on the edge of what, like death, can never be totally known. Franco Fornari, in Psychoanalysis of War, written in 1966, addressed psychoanalysts' competence to dwell in war matters and underlined his privilege in observing the individual modes or internal mechanisms through which political and social experiences in general are elaborated. Arguing against the often expressed view that psychoanalysis as an approach to war is non-specific because it is meta-historical, he stressed that while economical, political, and ideological factors are specific generators of conflicts, they are not specific factors of war. Fornari defined war as a specific social institution, one that persists beyond any social formation, any single social formation. He insisted that when conflicts are expressed in the form of war, it means that a new fact has come into existence. Similarly, tracing this palindrome of war in psychoanalysis, Rose has proposed that if therefore psychoanalysis has something to say about war, one might also reverse the proposition and suggest that war has something to say about psychoanalysis, or at the very least about its own relationship to knowledge, its own conception of what constitutes the truth. War does not only appear as an object of psychoanalytic investigation, of course. It provides the living context for key moments in the history of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has also found itself at war. The right to open up the Freudian corpus, to transform it, to recognize its interminability is the sole condition for the continuation of Freud's own work, even if that means continual disruption, even, therefore, if it means war. Perhaps then we remain truer to the spirit of psychoanalysis if we don't try to solve the problem of war, Rose suggests. Art and art history have too been concerned with this problematic, which we will now begin to look in closer detail. Art historian Rosalind Deutsch, in her book Hiroshima After Iraq, highlights the challenges faced when voices are raised on the subject of war from different grounds. As a corollary of its impatience with feminism, which has long insisted on the inseparability of the personal and the political, and on politics concerned with subjectivity, melancholic anti-war criticism tries to divide the subjective and the material, the public and the private, and the social and the psychic, as though war has nothing to do with mental life, as though there is no work of the psyche in the waging of war. Mignon Nixon has argued against the refusal to understand war in psychic terms. The habit of separating the psychical from the social, writes Nixon, the individual subject from social subjectivity, even seems redoubled in times of war, as if waging war depends upon holding these terms apart, as if to reflect on subjectivity in times of war were in itself to reject the political, even to diminish resistance to war. I want us now to start looking at art to see how works have traced the precarious balance between self and other, private and public, the individual and the social, the psychic and the cultural at times of war, where the mediation between such binary constructs becomes an operative function, and we will look at how psychoanalysis is uniquely poised, as Rose suggests, to respond to identities that harden like iron in response to the ills of the world. So a good way to go about this is to start with the aftermath of the Second World War, and to keep in mind how this moment, and every war for that matter, significantly overturns notions of representation. Hans Bellmer's La Poupée, The Doll, is a book of a series of photographs of doll sculptures that were produced in the 1930s by Bellmer, who announced that he would no longer produce work that could even indirectly be useful to the fascist state. Much emphasis has been placed on his biography and his childhood in the reading of this work. As a child, he developed fear and hatred for his tyrannical father, who totally dominated his gentle and affectionate mother, we read. He and his younger brother found refuge from this oppressive family atmosphere in a secret garden decorated with toys and souvenirs and visited by young girls who joined in sexual games. But even if we did not have this biographical information, we understand this work is obviously a very invested object. It was made and photographed incessantly as a direct response to Nazism and the notion of the armored body. It absorbs a multiplicity of phantasmatic opportunity and becomes an identification object for Bellmer and represents the psychic reality of that moment. The doll embodies war trauma, the experience of literally seeing the body in pieces, and presents how fragmented and regressive sexuality had become a fear, but one that was daringly and openly evidenced in art. Bellmer felt artistically isolated and vulnerable in Berlin, where far less provocative works had been branded degenerate by the Nazis. Having read about surrealism in art magazines, he sent a copy of the doll photographs to André Breton and Paul Éliard in Paris. The publication of the photographs in the surrealist magazine Minotaur in December 1934 caused enormous excitement among the surrealist group, who immediately appreciated the doll as an ideal surrealist object because of its conjunction of desire and revolt. 3 years later, in the International Surrealist Exhibition of 1938 in Paris, Ernst, Man Ray, Duchamp, Dali, and Miro, among others, exhibited rows of soap mannequins. This was done in retreat of their earlier revolutionary politics and in a vacuous variation on the theme of the female body as a symbol of desire and dread, as Nixon suggests. And I am too gonna mention Louise Bourgeois for a bit. Years later, after Louise Bourgeois arrived in New York, she produced the Femme Maison series in 1946 and 47, clearly following the stylistic changes of surrealist tradition and inventing a character, La Femme Maison, to portray the predicament of a woman artist and mother carrying the house on her head while trying to make it as a surrealist in the city. The femme fatale of pre-war surrealist fantasy becomes the Femme Maison of war and exile. She is not a typical woman figure from the surrealist imagination, but a new feminine type that struggles to free herself from displacement, domesticity, motherhood, masculine desire, and the post-war relegation of women back to the home. Humor and derision were Bourgeois' tools too, who joins in an obscene joke that is shared among men, with reference to an absent woman, a woman whose absence is an essential condition of the joke, as Freud informs us in Jokes and their relationship to the unconscious. So I want to briefly mention the part where she says that analysis is a joke. That is a tactic as well, both within her art and in her analysis experience. So there is a strategy there, I think. Juliet Mitchell has traced the post-war reoriented history of psychoanalytic theory away from hysteria and towards its substitute, femininity. Mitchell, in her examination of the disappearance of hysteria as diagnosis in the Western world, supports that it is connected with the advent of post-war male hysteria. She emphasizes that in time, diagnosis of traumatic neurosis won the day, and hysteria disappeared or became woman. The strengthening of the moral motherhood after the Second World War then comes as no surprise, since women in all classes had also been very actively engaged in war work. Mitchell locates the post-war reaction to this development in the re-establishment of gender divisions into women's spheres and issues around the motherhood and the home. I want us to look for a brief moment at Jacques, Pollock, and Yayoi Kusama in the mid to late 1950s. Pollock, the post-war hero of American art and abstract expressionism, is known for his dripping technique, the automatism, and masculine performativity in his work. Kusama, on the other hand, in her confrontation with surrealism and the New York School on her arrival to the United States, who was also working through automatism to produce these canvases, had to work extra hard to carve out a place for her in this artistic milieu. Outrivaling and overdoing pushed her into another scale with her immense infinity nets, who tackle post-war fragmentation and trauma in a different way. So what and who became celebrated at the time is very telling for what society's needs were, and this was no different in art and in its histories. Through psychoanalysis, we are then led to investigate and think about what was projected onto abstraction. Let us now return to the post-war considerations of the domestic, subjectivity, and agency, and turn to the Vietnam War and the work of Martha Rosler and Nancy Spiro. Martha Rosler's Bringing the War Home, House Beautiful, produced between 1967 and 72, utilizes the collage technique favored by the surrealists and later by the pop artists, but Rosler's central concern is not restricted to the unconscious. Produced during the peak of US military engagement in Vietnam and during Rosler's own involvement with anti-war activities, these photo montages are a response to the artist's frustration with the images we saw in television and print media, even with anti-war flyers and posters. The images we saw were always very far away, in a place we could not imagine, she said. Assembled from the pages of Life magazine, where the documentary accounts of blown bodies, dead babies, and anguished faces flew seamlessly into mattress ads and photo features of sophisticated kitchens, fastidiously fertilized lawns, and art-hung living rooms, Rosler's montages reconnect two sides of human experience, the war in Vietnam and the living rooms in America, which have been falsely separated. The war was always at home, or at least this is where it starts from. Rosler made her images fit into the frames of American domestic property, their precise positioning into rectangular windows and picture frames. Is less a design than a visual clue to the cognitive connection Rosler is making. These images of war are not imposed or forced into these living rooms, they belong here. In 1959, Nancy Spiro and her husband, the painter Leon Golub, moved from New York to Paris for the sake of their artistic survival, where according to Spiro, the art world was more open as she was not immediately characterized as wife or mother. But after a series of paintings in which lovers were intimately depicted, called the Black Paintings, Spiro painted this, Les Anges meurent fuck you, in 1960. Les Anges, the angels in French, meurent, shit, and fuck you flow on the painting as a script or graffito, while three little heads with unseeing eye holes and protruding bloody tongues charge towards the edge of the painting. Spiro recalled being frustrated with her position, feeling angry and violent as she found herself at the grips of maternal anger in the face of the Vietnam War. This work portrays the violence of splitting the maternal voice from public discourse and offers art as protest. Upon the couple's return to New York, confronted with the escalating American involvement in Vietnam, and recognized they were no longer expatriates, Spiro produced a war series. I started working rapidly on paper, she recalls. Angry works, often scatological, manifestos against a senseless, obscene war, a war that my sons could have been called up for. Those works were exorcisms to keep the war away. I started off painting the bomb and total destruction. I was so impatient I would spit and rub. I even rubbed holes into the paper. My anger really flowed with the war series, thinking as a mother. Spiro was very active in resistance to the Vietnam War, taking part in anti-war shows and benefits, but the imagery of the war series does not comply, as Mignon Nixon says, with conventional expectations of what a woman artist thinking as a mother might produce. In the war series, she narrates, angry screaming heads in clouds of bombs spew and vomit poison onto the victims below. Phallic tongues emerge from human heads at the tips of penile extensions of bombs or helicopter blades. What Spear does as an artist, thinking as a mother, is to incarnate the phantasmatic dimension of war, to invoke the infantile, sadistic, often sexualized mania that pervades even the most calculated and controlled forms of aggression, Nixon suggests, and places emphasis on the noticeable return to Melanie Klein, both in psychoanalytic work and in the artistic production of the 60s and 70s. The War series is analyzed by Nixon as a work that asks the important yet neglected question of war sexuality that Juliet Mitchell has explored in her work. How has it been possible, Mitchell asks, to ignore the intimate relationship of rampant sexuality and war violence? For Mitchell, war sexuality is hysterical sexuality. In Hysteria, she writes, it is not just that sex and death have come together as a fused drive, it is rather that something violent has been sexualized. In this way, in the War series, as Nixon suggests, Sparrow spoke out publicly against the war in Vietnam, dramatizing the hysterical violence of warfare, its stimulation of the desire to kill, its fusion of sex and violence, its toll on psychic death, but also the hysteria that is projected onto political resistance as the protests of victims and critics alike are put down as irrational and dismissed as impotent rage. War, Sparrow suggests, is hysterical in its very recourse to action in preference to speech. Let us explore further the effect that war has on language through the works of Jenny Holzer and Adila Jusik about the Bosnian War of the early 1990s. There was widespread perpetration of war rape during the Bosnian War fought by the country's three main ethnic groups, the Bosniaks, the Serbs, and the Croats. While on a lesser scale, women of all ethnic groups were affected, more specifically, rape was used as a systematized instrument of war by the Bosnian Serb forces, predominantly targeting women and girls of the Bosnian Muslim ethnic group for physical and moral destruction. In response to the violence against women committed in the Bosnian ethnic cleansing, American artist Jenny Holzer made the Lustmord series, named from a German word meaning murder as sexual proclivity. The first installment of this work was in 1993, published in this German magazine, and if I'm not mistaken, I don't speak German, this reads, I am awake in the place where women die. And it was written with ink that contained about, I think, 5% of blood donated by Yugoslavian and German women. That at the time created a huge controversy in Germany, but also around the world because news traveled. That was really closely related to the AIDS panic of the early 1990s. And there was an incident actually in Berlin where the health system started giving out blood that was not tested for the HIV virus, and there were incidents of people getting contaminated. But that's the side story, because what you saw inside were these pictures. Jenny Holzer wrote a text on her own. This is her writing about the mass war rapes of the Bosnian War from three different perspectives, from the perspective of the perpetrator, the victim, and the observer. She then used that ink and wrote it on women's skin and photographed the text, and it appeared page by page. There were about 25 photographs. You could not place which text was part of the perpetrator speaking, or the observer, or the victim. And you could not also make out the body, the part of the body that this text was written on. There are a few more pictures, I think, of that. And then the following year, in Barbara Gladstone Gallery in New York, there was the second installment of Lustmord, where she constructed a small hat. I don't have a picture of that. But it was a small hat that was lined on the inside with leather, onto which she carved the text, again, in chance parts inside the structure. You could not know which part of the structure was corresponding to which position of the text. And then in the next room, she had tables on which she arranged human bones that also were some of them, not all of them, were wrapped in a silver band, and on that there were parts of the text, and the visitor was actually invited to pick up the bone and twist it and turn it to read the text. And another detail about this installment is that the silver that was used for the production of these silver bands was in part made by the silverware of her mother, who passed away a month before she made that work.
Sorry, so it's text written on the silver?
Yes.
Not on the bones?
Not on the bone, it's on the silver. And the final installment of that work is in 1997 in Leipzig in Germany, on where she projected on the war memorial in the main square that text. The text kept changing, and there was a reflection in a pool of water or a fountain that is underneath the memorial over there. So I want you, if possible, to keep this in mind, and then I want to spend a little time to see the work by Adila Jusic, a Bosnian artist that made a film in 2007 called The Sniper, in which she reads her father's notebooks, who operated as a sniper in besieged Sarajevo during the war. I want to hear from the floor if anyone has any thoughts on the works that we've seen so far, and particularly the last two ones, because they speak about the same period in time.
Can you tell us a bit just more about that work?
Mm-hmm. It was the artist is called Adila Jusic, and she made this film in 2007. And as I said before, she found her father's notebooks from the war when he was operating as a sniper in Sarajevo, where there was nothing else besides what you just heard, which is just numbers and just keeping track of the people who he had shot. And it ends quite abruptly, and this is the part where she just informs the viewer of the video that on that day another sniper shot her father. But I guess I
thought initially it was going to come back to the thing about rape.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was about the rape. I thought that stabbing red mark was what that was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So to turn it around and discover that it's basically straight hit, man on man violence is quite interesting. I suppose the woman enters in with the words "my father,"
Mm-hmm.
and it's her voice.
Mm-hmm. And another axis, yes, of course, the daughter-father relationship is very interesting in this work. Something that is not really the focus of Jenny Holzer, but I think that another axis that I'm interested in looking at these both works is how language is broken down or utilized differently or goes into complete silence when artists are in a way inclined to make war that speaks about war. And there is a really interesting, I don't really want to say progression in a linear sort of way, but there is a really interesting theme of language as an object in war-related artistic practice. You can go from silence, you can go to writing, as Jenny Holzer does. And also another difference, since we're talking about art and psychoanalysis beyond biography, is that Jenny Holzer is American, and this girl is from the place of that war. And what is interesting is also that to participate in that discourse takes a lot of energy in an analytic way, and make a work that is an actual intervention on that discourse. It's not just a work about a description of a historical event.
I just want to come back to this, I suppose, the discussion, the first part of the paper about a kind of coupling. psychoanalytically based cultural criticism, if I call it that, of the problem of war.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it asks the question, you know, what is war? You know, what does it represent in terms of culturally based desires,
Mm-hmm.
or impulses or something like that? I mean, it's a kind of, it feels to me like a criticism that's, you know, now would be that'd be quite a difficult kind of discourse to entertain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, you know, I mean, I think we can talk about the military-industrial complex. We could talk about, you know, nation states. We can talk about forms of rhetoric about human rights, or all these kinds of things as contexts in which conflicts are occur. You know, maybe also, you know, frameworks around religious difference or whatever, right? But I mean, do you? I don't know what people think. Whether the idea that we might talk about war as an expression, I suppose, of deep-seated, you know, almost like psychosocial impulses, I find very difficult. You know, I find that quite difficult. I mean, I identify with people like Freud or with people like, you know, Bataille that I've worked on. You know, a kind of economization, you know, of cultural psychic or psychic conflicts expressed culturally, let's say. But you know, it's not a sort of way of approaching,
Mm-hmm.
you know, global conflicts now that I would want to run with, you know, because I think it, in a way, tries to transpose, or in a way to almost legitimate, you know, the notion of war as part of an economy, you know, a human economy, as some inevitable trans-historical phenomenon, you know, ever present in all cultures, all this kind of thing. So you know, that's my feeling about that, and I guess in terms of the visual art material you've been presenting, it seems to me that most of that actually. Question: is it about that, or is it actually about the impact of war, or ways of polemicising about war in a very intentional way, in the sense of, you know, Nancy Sparrow, you know, that sort of sperm bomb stuff, and that to me is quite different from the idea of these works as a kind of symptom of that, say, impulse to violence or whatever. That's my question, really, discussion.
Well, you know, there's different things here, isn't there? I mean, there's the sort of issue of how you represent it at all, and then there's the issue of why you represent it. Right? So
yeah,
you could be representing it
yes.
from a sort of agitprop point of view. In other words, you're trying to stop the war, and that's what Roswell is doing, or to try and at least make visible the huge disconnect between the foreign war, which doesn't affect the thing at home. I think, though, actually trying to represent the war, there's a very interesting set of evidence for war photography. You know, because in every case, every 20th century war, there was photography. And the interesting thing about war is it should be possible to take exactly the same set of photos each time, because people get blown up in the same way. People, you know, it's all horrible, and the mise en scène doesn't matter that much. The central thing is a sort of unrepresentable thing. And in fact, people did take the same photos in every single war, but they weren't published. And also there are stylistic differences. And these have to do with the political context of whether or not, how far the war was back to home. Right?
Of course. Just a brief comment on both of your comments over there. I'm not really sure whether we can go about this topic talking about either or. What I was interested in presenting these works, and there are more to come as well if we have time for it, is that it was to present works that do actually have a close relationship to psychoanalytic theory, and although it can be challenging, it is a relationship that both helps us to look at art and life, as the previous panel said, what it means to be alive, and one of those reasons on what it means to be alive is structure on war and psychoanalytic theories of the death drive and the life drive and the corpus of theory around that. But also, I was interested at the same time, again, not either or, in taking a bird's eye view and seeing what it means to do art history to put this work in a psychoanalytic context, in a historical context as well. And you're absolutely right. Photography plays a very important role in the way that we look at art and images of war at the same time. And the other thing that I highlighted was that in each war there is a crisis of representation. So that's why the following works that I've left for the end of our session here represent different modes of representation as an effect of war discourse and war history. So, for example, the following work that we can see is the Hiroshima Projection by Christopher Ditchko. That is another moment that has shaped both psychoanalytic theory and art production. And then we move to a very different kind of war that we still find in ourselves today, the war on terror, the war that has troubled questions of self and other. Who is a terrorist? It can be a homegrown terrorist. It is not the racial other that we're just targeting. The war of images, as you said. We went from the embedded journalism and in Vietnam, which was also an image-based war, to having people photograph themselves while torturing people in a grape, and that being disseminated instantly around the world. Let's just, do we have time to look at a couple of stuff? Yeah. So this is Christopher Ditchko in 1999 in Hiroshima, and this piece is called the Hiroshima Projection, where it took place on 2 nights in August, immediately after the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing in 1945, where he interviewed many different kinds of survivors. There were the Japanese survivors, there were Korean immigrants who were abused by Japanese imperialist factory owners, and there were also the 3rd and 2nd generation survivors, so the children of the victims of the bombing. And you can hear the audio of these witnesses giving their story about that day and speaking about how it is to be in Hiroshima today. And at the same time, Ditchko videotaped their hands as they were speaking. And there's a reflection that happens on the river. And let's just watch a couple of minutes and talk about it. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can talk about this. What I was interested in is both, again, how we see a shift in the representation. In representation, there is far less rubbing and spitting and abject forms, and we focus on the hands. And there's also the question of projecting it on an actual war memorial, and what it means to consider sight and body at the same time, but also how that building that has been sitting there silent for all this time actually is given a voice by an artist who is actually listening to it, and those people who were there were finally given a voice as well, because it is well known that there was censorship in Hiroshima about their experiences. People were not allowed to speak on what had happened to them. And Ditchko becomes an artist analyst in a way, a psychotherapist to the building, who actually gains a corporeal presence. And then, of course, there's the the river and the reflection on the river, which operates on a lateral dimension, a lateral psychic dimension, if you may, that disseminates the story across the city. Does anyone?
I hate to be the ogre to break up this conversation, but I think that's a good place to end.
Okay.
Also, coincidentally, it happens to be the time for our tea break.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.